Starting over. So right now we're gonna cover the negative ground. In this topic, because there are so many parts of the topic, the negative ground is going to start off pretty generically so that there's a guarantee of a link. And then other teams will develop specific topic links after that. So the first one is the executive powers dissad. You're going to argue, or the negative would argue that the executive branch needs to be able to have flexible decision-making capacities in order to engage in wars, and that if we don't, then we won't be able to make the right decisions to be able to keep America safe. The econ dissad will mostly focus on the limiting of executive powers, will stop the United States from being able to conduct trade as effectively. So, for example, this would be mostly linked to the trade topic area because it's mainly about how, it's mainly about our trade of products with other countries. But you can also link it to treaties that, for example, the Paris Climate Change Agreement is bad for the U.S. economy because it's bad for our energy sector and our profits. But you can also talk about maybe, actually those would be the main ones. For the midterms dissad, the main uniqueness link or uniqueness argument that people make on the negative is like Democrats will win, but if you pass this will make it so that the Republicans win in the House and that the Republicans will accelerate whatever bad policies that Trump is going to do anyways. So that's like the main link that they will use to try to turn the affirmative, and then also provide an external impact such as like nuclear war or whatever. The fourth one is the courts dissad. So this will be mainly against affirmatives that use the courts as a way to limit the executive branch. They'll make the argument that the courts don't have the enforcement mechanism to be able to limit the executive branch. So, for example, when Andrew Jackson wanted to relocate Native Americans, and then the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. That's illegal. Native Americans are a sovereign peoples. And then Andrew Jackson basically told the Supreme Court, you and whose army? Or you and what army? And then so the Supreme Court couldn't do anything, and then Native Americans were relocated on the Trail of Tears. This is also going to be relevant to this will be relevant to any of the topic areas, the 5 topic areas involved, because it'll be about how the Supreme Court, for example, can't really limit the president's ability to do surveillance or to do trade. The other one, and this is probably the dissad that this team will go for a lot on this year's topic, is the circumvention dissad. Circumvention dissad is basically saying that the executive branch will find other bureaucratic means to be able to implement the policies that they want. So, for example, even if you got rid of like nuclear first use, the president will figure out some other policy, judicial deference, for example, to justify nuclear first use. And then the democracy disadvantage, this could be dependent on what angle you're headed at. So, for example, if you want to say democracy bad for national security from a more conservative standpoint, then you can say that. Because most of the affirmatives or a lot of the affirmatives will have democracy advantages, like the surveillance topic. So you want to say like democracy makes it ineffective to fight terrorism, for example. Or you can come in from a radical left position and say democracy is like a form of Eurocentrism, or it's another form of colonialism, etc. And so that's why the affirmative's defense of democracy is doing it in bad faith because they're defending like the empire or whatever. The different types of counterplans, you'll find a lot of agency counterplans because different affirmatives will use different branches of the government, and then so you'll have negative counterplans that use different branches of the government, and there'll be a competition or a clash over which branch should do the plan. So if the AF is about like legislative, or there's an AF. Oh wow, never mind. It should say executive, legislative, and judicial, not executive, Congress, and legislative. But for example, if they do legislative affirmative, then you can do a courts counterplan in response. Or if they have a courts AF, then you can do legislative counterplan in response. The other counterplan is a process counterplan. So we can get to the same place, but we will do it through a different process. One of them is like the referendum counterplan. The referendum is where we have a vote and all of America votes on whether this policy should pass. And then that always comes with its own weird net benefit of like democracy or something like that on top of whatever the advantages that the affirmative is defending. Then you can have a constitutional amendment process counterplan. That's when Congress and the Senate get together and pass an amendment to prevent in order to address one of the 5 topic areas. And then the last counterplan, probably be popular is impeach Trump, because a lot of affirmatives will be specific to Trump's like behavior and mentality. So, for example, a lot of affirmatives about nuclear first use might say something about how Trump is an erratic and rogue agent, and he should not be trusted with nuclear weapons. So you can say something like, no, the presidency needs this power, but like Trump is the wrong person for it, so we should impeach Trump instead. So you can have different disads attached to that. Are there any other disadvantages or counter plans that you all have thought about for this topic? Okay. If you have any specific questions on each of these are actually available in the topic paper, that was released. So that's also a homework assignment for those who haven't done it already. Read the topic paper. It's actually inside the critique folder under the topic folder. It's called the topic. So this lecture is also under there. So yeah. All right. Topicality. The three parts of the debate that will be ground for topicality debates. One will be substantially reduced. There will be debates about what counts as substantially reducing or not. People get different percentages, 100%, 10%, etc. The other one is restricts. There are different types of restrictions, and some things are not considered restrictions, even though it sounds like they are. So some teams will definitely clamp down on what counts as statutory versus judicial. So if you use anything outside of those, that could be a reason that you are violating topicality. There are different questions of what limitations are, meaning like, for example, restriction requires that you actually have to limit the ability for the executive branch to do a certain action. And so if you don't fall under those lines, then you also are not topical. And also the question of specificity. What if the affirmative was just something like the president should not be able to pardon someone? Like that's like a really small affirmative, but you might be able to defend that a specific act like that is topical, whereas the negative will say, no, you have to defend the more broad topic area and not just like the president can't pardon someone. And then executive power will be, an issue of topicality as well. What I wrote there is, that the other branches have to provide some level of oversight over the executive branch in order to count as being topical. So if they don't provide oversight, that might be another reason that they link. And also, it has to prevent unilateral action. And so unilateral executive action is when the executive branch can do whatever they want without having oversight or without having someone edit their decision-making capabilities. And then so you have to be able to prevent some sort of unilateral action. So the president can't just like send the troops to whatever country, and that they need congressional approval. All right, so negative critiques. The different types of critiques people run. So different topics have different areas of critique. It usually is something to do with the government or something to do with the market or the economy. So usually, if it has to do more with the government, the critique is usually a security critique or like some sort of biopower critique, which is what this topic is about. In other examples where it was like what's an economic topic where that covers China, right, trade agreements, right? Then you would be more focusing on like the CAP-K, because that's about like trade between countries and trade between corporations. So the key links that you'll get a lot here is sovereignty and national security. Sovereignty, the idea that there is a government that gets to make decision-making capabilities. That's also tied to the idea of executive power, because the executive is the sovereign who can make decisions. So the one example, so I'll get into what that means too. And the national security, the question of what are we trying to secure and for who, and those are questions that the critique will often pose in order to address how the affirmative's ideas of national security are limited and mainly there to protect elite interests. So the different types of so I separate critiques into three different categories. It's not like the most clean categories, but mainly postmodernism, Marxism, and radical identity politics. That's my phrasing, not really nobody else calls it that, but that's kind of the phrase I went with. Postmodernism affirmatives. So general breakdown postmodernism, it's about the deconstruction of capital T truth, that there is no meta narrative that we all abide by, but rather there are little T truths that that affect our everyday experiences and perceptions. So the biopower critique is about how the idea of a central government that gets to make decisions is the basis for fascism. For Foucault, he talks about it as the panopticon, as we talked about, right? and the panopticon being able to create mass surveillance as a means of mass population control. Agamben extends from Foucault and talks about how sovereignty is the means by which we are able to establish governmental power. He talks about how sovereignty is able to create what he calls the state of exception. The state of exception is where you are under the authority of the law, but the law is not accountable to the law. That makes sense. So, for example, a terrorist, Guantanamo Bay, the people there are subordinate under the law, but then the law is not held legally accountable. The CIA can torture their people, and they won't be held as war criminals, for example. And similar to the way that the police interact with people, who keeps the police accountable? Question. That's a real question. Who keeps the police accountable? Like in the status quo, not like, yeah. I'll give you the answer. The police. The police keep themselves accountable. That's the only people. So therefore, if the law is the only one keeping themselves accountable, then they're not really accountable to anyone. That's his idea of the state of exception. Richard Nixon had a pretty succinct quote about it. He says, when the president does it, it is not illegal, right? So when the law does it, it's not legal. So that means, the idea of sovereignty is always going to be bankrupt and corrupt because it gives absolute power to government over people. The security K is more based on Heidegger literature about the way in which we try to securitize the world around us and the amount of violence we are willing to commit in order to keep our sense of security. So that will be a main one as far as that addresses like a lot of affirmatives that try to maintain national security. They might say something like, Trump not getting nuclear weapons or not having nuclear first use is key to keeping international stability. And then the security K will come in and be like, stability for who? Like stability for elites, stability for government bureaucrats, etc. And then hyperreality, one of my favorite arguments, I think will be possible in this topic a lot because the idea of the executive branch as the display of power is itself kind of hyperreal. And I think this is also really relevant because Trump is kind of hyperreal. He is literally a pop culture icon that is now in a position of power, and now we have a blend of politics and pop culture. And that there's no there used to be a distinction between the two, and now there's not. And so now we're all stuck in fake news land. And yeah, there's no escape. Resistance is futile. Any questions about postmodernism? All right, cool. Marxism. The two main links that I would get from the Marxism is one, treaties. The idea that countries are able to maintain treaties with each other is the basis for how we are able to create economic relations with each other. So, for example, if countries are like, "Hey, we should stop our economic sanctions of Iran," and that would improve Iran's economy. That would be basically saying what you mean is you want corporations to go to Iran and exploit the workers there. As far as the other link would be war. Marxism's explanation for why war happens is over wars over resources and the competition over them. And so that provides like a uniqueness and a root cause explanation for why wars happen that capitalism teams will use, or capitalism critique teams will use. And then radical identity politics. The main ones here will be anti-blackness and settler colonialism. Anti-blackness will be about how the state is a signifier of humanism because the state is the idea of a human collectivity or community that makes decisions on people. And then settler colonialism will be similar in that the executive branch is what maintains territoriality or the ownership over space of this country, and how that is something that we need to decolonize. So questions about critiques and what they look like. Okay, cool. So discussion time. What affirmatives, based on, we can go one at a time. 1, first use, 2, trade, 3, treaties, 4, war, 5, surveillance. What critical apps can you, what critical apps have you been thinking about as far as nuclear affirmatives? I have some ideas. Montres?
So I thought of one where it's like a postmodernist app where war has
By the way, everyone should write down these ideas.
War has become sort of like hyper real, and we see images of war, but not the actual war.
Oh.
And then I thought about nuclear strikes because there's always the danger of a nuclear strike, but deterrence and mutually assured destruction pretty much ensure that it won't happen. But that fear of a nuclear strike allows the government to place control over us so that we're in a feared state. And I was trying to wonder, I was thinking about how I can apply that more to the executive position.
Mm-hmm.
So I was trying to go through like old Gojira cards, but I couldn't really find anything about like executive authority yet.
Yeah.
That's a work in progress.
Yeah, well, Gojira definitely writes about nuclear war, but the relevant literature that we can explore there, he wrote a book called The Gulf War Never Happened, right? I.e., the way that we experience war is mainly through media images, and we don't experience the material reality of war. It's just something that happens elsewhere. Like, does anybody know how many countries were bombing?
A lot.
The Middle East.
7 to 8, about 7 to 8. But we don't experience these material conditions of war. And when we do want to experience these conditions of war, we go to the media and we experience it through there. So in a way, we sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia bombs Yemenis children. In fact, like one of Trump's first military operations killed like an 8-year-old girl who's an American citizen actually in Yemen. So yeah, but yeah, that's actually a good place to take this topic. The idea that we do not experience war. War itself is hyperreal, and that hyperreality is used as a means of social control. So good. Other nuclear ideas of nuclear weapons, or not just nuclear weapons, by the way. We should just talk about nuclear, including nuclear energy, because I think all those are relevant.
I'm not sure. I haven't really figured out which one of these I would apply it to, but I had an idea for an app performance one of doing white face and white body and showing like kind of highlighting how like to achieve power in the United States you have to do like certain performance that occurs, and that like when certain people do that performance it like creates like a monstrosity, and then like that monstrosity is like then like literally Trump, because white people are just like white people are like indigenous people who have given away their indigeneity, so like that's literally what the monstrosity that creates becomes.
Is that a general application to, or
I was thinking like
to what aspect of the topic?
Well, like nukes. I was thinking. Well, but it could fit into anything. That's why I'm not really sure like how to make it specific.
I mean, indigenous.
I've only been kind of thinking of how to apply it to like.
There's two particular examples of indigenous relationships to nuclear energy or nuclear weapons. One, indigenous people in the United States who were were bombed on by nuclear testing when we first tested nuclear weapons was on indigenous land, who were then affected by nuclear radiation. There's actually 3 examples. The second example is nuclear waste dumping and nuclear. The United States hired indigenous people to dig up like nuclear uranium, and that gave them a lot of radiation poisoning in their communities too. So that's 2. And the third one, does anybody know the island of the Bikini Atoll? Yeah. So during the 1950s, the United States was testing nuclear weapons in the Pacific Ocean, so we basically kicked out a lot of indigenous people in those islands so that we could bomb those islands to test our nuclear weapons. So that's actually an interesting take on settler colonialism, because it's not just about land, it's also about water. And we can talk about the way that the territoriality of water is a part of U.S. nuclear policies too. The archipelagos is what it's called, a series of islands. I think that's about it as far as ideas about nuclear.
Well, the specific white face performance doesn't have to solely be tied to like settler colonialism or like indigeneity, or like it is in like the analysis. But so like, do I have to then connect that to like you're saying like example? Like I don't know how to connect.
The options that you have are either these 5 topic areas or executive power. You can have an app that's just about executive power.
That's what I was.
And then
that one.
Yeah.
So just from listening to it, I talk mostly like a surveillance type argument.
Right.
Yeah. It's like we are like surveilled by the system / USFG, which causes us to like try to pass and creates all these forms of like subjectivity that didn't exist before.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah.
But that's if that's where you want to go, that's where I see that heading.
I think I could do like huge commentary on executive power and then like in relation to surveillance. And, like, really...
For sure. Yeah. Let's see. Other examples of let's do one at a time on each of the topic areas.
Now that you have kind of these looks into it, flesh out what some of those specific appendages would be that connect some of those ideas.
I'm trying to think about nuclear weapons in the context of anti-blackness. The 2 examples I can think of: South Africa being one of the 3 countries that denuclearized, and so like that's something that's been talked about. And I have a feeling people are going to talk about like science experimentation on like black people, like Tuskegee experiment and stuff like that, because that has to do.
I mean, there's also I don't know which specific country, but for a while, so North African countries were under scrutiny for presence of yellow cake,
Mhm.
and like the criminalization of like black people through like those like dangerous elements in North Africa. More like a metaphor for anti-blackness than the actual one in the United States, but that was a big thing. Like,
For sure. Yeah.
At least like 20 years ago.
Yeah, I know a little bit more on the relationship between nuclear weapons and Orientalism because of the Cold War, right? So North Korea, Iran is based on like ideas of nuclear Orientalism. There's also, oh, by the way, Vietnam. The United States offered France to nuke Vietnam when when the Vietnamese were fighting the French, and then the French were like, "Nah, it's too far. It's going too far. You can't nuke them." Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting one. What other? Oh yeah, duh. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. You make a Godzilla app. I have a Godzilla app. It's just in the file somewhere. You can steal it.
Was the Love Canal disaster? Was that nuclear material or just radioactive?
I don't know. But we can talk about nuclear disasters too. Oh, there's a book by crap. I forgot his name. Chalupka. Do you remember Chalupka? It's like we should make fun of the bomb, like because it's funny. But like also like by making fun of the bomb, we kind of de-idolize the power of the bomb. Yeah, it's a weird book. I have that book. I could send it out to someone. But yeah, we can move on to the next one. So trade. What critical areas can we talk about for trade? Who trades, and what are we trading?
Well, obviously, so part of the indigenous futurism thing I'm running is like how like the space Indian and the Afro-futurists would like exist in the like the spatial dimension of like outer space. So like I guess I haven't really, but I know something could be there for like the relations, like how resources would be like, distributed or not distributed, but like,
Yeah, trade.
handled in that realm.
Trade is a question of who and what, right?
Yeah.
So the who and so what's in the status quo, trade is between sovereign nations, and the trade what we are trading is commodities, right? So a critical app would try to address or deconstruct those two categories: the idea of the sovereign and the idea of the commodity. And you can make you can have like indigenous settler colonialism or decolonization affirmative about the idea of sovereignty and the idea that two sovereigns trade with each other is a violent way to understand property rights, etc. And then so we can deconstruct that. As far as commodities go, you can have like a Marxism affirmative about the trade between, the trade within what we are trading, i.e. commodities, is based on exploitation of workers, etc. And as far as from an anti-blackness perspective, the idea of trade presumes a subject who is able to have agency and make decisions about what to trade. So yeah, I mean that's the entire topic, the idea of the subject. But any other ones about trade?
I really like the Orientalism of China as a threat. Well, I don't like that, criticizing that.
Yeah.
And like how that informs like U.S. policy, like something in that direction.
Yeah, for sure. I actually wrote an app for this high school talk about immigration, about Chinese lead contagion, and like there's an app on that. We affirm white people getting poisoned by lead. Yeah, it disrupts things. All right. Anybody else on trade? Okay, treaties. We can talk about treaties. Are there treaties from the past that are like messed up?
No.
Yeah. Treaties. What are treaties? How can we engage with treaties critically?
I think there's like a lot of realm for like running pessimism and like indigenous pessimism, like with treaties, like evidence. Yeah.
Yeah,
because I've been thinking a lot about running like indigenous pessimism and like making that.
Question: isn't the ballot a treaty? just sit on that one for a while. Any other treaties?
I mean, it's not one of the apps that I was thinking about, like, for Work Week, but something that I've been thinking about, like, before is an app based on Chidi Hidalgo, and I was thinking maybe it's like a cowboy or, like, vigilante performance. I just think that shit would be so cool.
Cowboy vigilante?
Yeah, I don't know what it would have to do with Chidis or this topic, but I want to run that.
Gabby cut an indigenous fugitivity affirmative a while ago. Like you can combine it with some emotin stuff about fugitivity, and it can basically be like an indigenous emotin affirmative.
Yeah,
it's like possible, and then you can address treaties along the way, like the fugitive in relation to the treaty. You know,
because like after that specific treaty, like everybody was vigilante, like because they just had so much more land, and so I think it's interesting.
Okay, for sure. Yeah, specifically, treaties between the United States and indigenous communities often involve the idea of separating. So indigenous people had land that they live on. A lot of them don't consider like private ownership of land per se. And then the United States separated them into individual plots of land and then put money value on them. And then they use that as a basis to buy the land and then like limit indigenous people to secluded reservations.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of like set potential there because like even on like the Mexico side of things, like they had already like fucked up their indigenous communities. So like the land that they were giving away or like that the US took was already colonized. So it's like colonization on top of colonization. And it's like it's just I don't know. I think there's a lot of potential there.
All right, for sure. Okay, I think we move on to the next ones. War powers. Well, how can we talk about war in relation to the topic? Which wars are happening? Who's at war? Who's affected by war? How do we define war? Those are questions. I'm down to
Well,
sit
yeah,
silent.
we would have to define war though. Because
I'm down to dwell, by the way, in silence. That's like my thing. So
we have to like define war, like okay, because it's like there's not a right answer, because it's like then that's part of the critique is like analyzing how different societies have war.
Yeah, I'm not looking for the right answer. I'm just looking for your
Yeah.
answer. So what's your answer on what is war? Who's affected by war?
Like, because immediately what came to mind is just like that, like native warfare was like just a different like thing, like it was organized differently and like handled differently than like colonial war.
Okay, what's the difference?
Like so, like one was like based off of like assuming for the future, like okay, so it's like one was based on like domination and conquering other peoples, while the other one was like basically kind of I like to think of it as like a synthesis that happened, like where conflicts and then there were like still moments of like diplomacy between them, but it wasn't like based on like the idea of conquering. It was more like based on movement. Like sorry, I'm not
Maybe.
I'm not able to like
I think there is like a risk of romanticizing the past, of romanticizing pre-colonial societies in ways that do more to stereotype them than actually engage
yeah,
with
but
the
I
reality.
guess what I mean is like right because obviously it's not just one monolithic thing, but it's to
Yeah,
like
exactly.
I feel like part of a critique that like is talking about war powers like has to really kind of acknowledge how like between positionalities like or like warfare in an indigenous realm is just in specific indigenous realms has existed like so it's like we have to talk about what kind of warfare is happening. You feel like
Yeah, there's an article that everyone here should read on this topic. It's by Nelson Maldonado Torres. I spelled that wrong. Oh yeah, it's called "On the Coloniality of Being." It's really good. It's about how the structure and condition of colonialism is itself a state of war, and anybody who is indigenous or black under colonialism is always a victim of war. It's also a pretty good criticism of Heidegger because Heidegger talks about how ontologically we're always moving towards death. Or like death is some future thing that we're always moving towards, so we have to like rethink our ontology in relation to that. And then Maldonado Torres comes in and says that no, Heidegger's idea of death as a future event does not speak to the experiences of colonized people where death is an everyday experience, not a future experience. Yeah. Anyways, I think it's a pretty good article. It should be cut on this topic for sure.
What was it called?
On the Coloniality of Being by Nelson Maldonado. He liked my Facebook post.
You know you're a celebrity, so
Let's see. Anybody else on war powers?
It also has to do with like the legitimacy they give to certain like war, or, like what you perceive as a threat informs the way that you address that, and like
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Threats. Who counts as a threat? And a threat to who? Like, no, yeah. What's your answer? I think you know.
Everyone and everything.
What's up?
Like everything. You know? Alright, I think it also depends on like a threat to what? Like what part of your state.
Right. So in the status quo, who is considered a threat and a threat to what?
Well, I feel like everything is being perceived as a threat to like national security, especially.
Everything. So white people
Uh,
are threat to national security.
well, okay. I don't know.
When a white person shoots up a school, what are they called?
Mentally ill.
Mentally ill. They're called mass shooters, right?
Yeah.
When a person of color shoots up a nightclub, what are they called?
Terrorism.
Terrorists. So what's the difference between shooting up a church, shooting up a school, shooting up a nightclub? Something to think about. Surveillance. Last one.
Before we leave
What's
one
up?
hour two, one of the things I was thinking about in relation to kind of just the status quo of pick a social issue. Like, what is a declaration of war? Right? When we have this president, we have this kind of regime of power, we have this kind of uncalibrated vendetta seemingly against people in authority and common people. What do the common people do? And when they are then faced with declarations of war, right? You generally think about declarations of war being between countries. What happens when we have declarations of war inside of this country between people, between the president and his people, right? Like, those are things to interrogate about as well. What substantiates, what manifests, what is the genesis of a war, right? How do we kind of calculate that back? A lot of times, and without crossing too many lines in the world of hyperrealism, we don't really know where these wars come from, right? But it might be interesting to interrogate the origins of the war we find ourselves in, and the everyday types of violence, right, that occur as direct offshoot of those declarations of war.
Yeah, I just thought of something like I remember like a couple months ago reading an article where someone from one of the Lakota communities said that like one of the treaties, like the last treaty, one of the like big last treaties that he said like that was the declaration of the real war because he was like, yo, we like stomped them out like initially, but then when like it became a treaty and then like displacement and like boundaries and shit like that were like being enacted like on a more casual level, I guess.
Yeah.
You know, that's what like really started the war that like is genocide and creating the prisoners of war.
Got you. So war, for example, is violence. So what does violence look like? How do we define violence? How do we define war? That maybe those definitions are more fluid than we usually imagine. So for example, two things. One, read this article. Like read it, not like debate read it, but like read it. So war is not an event. Reflections on the significance of something. So the article is about how war is not an event that has a beginning and end. World War I, World War II, the Cold War. War is a structure, meaning that there is violence happening every day at the structural level. And not just war, but violence is happening at a structural level. And when we only contain war as like specific military conflicts, then we are denying the existence or oftentimes downplaying the existence of things like poverty and hunger, famine, etc. The second thing, what's up? Chris Cuomo. Chris Cuomo is taking this from a feminist perspective. The second thing I would talk about, the police. In the war, we consider the soldiers to be the agents of war. But what are the police in relation to war and in relation to the way we understand violence? So, example on the war powers topic, Oklahoma, what's his last name? Campbell. Oh yeah, CL. Yeah, Oklahoma CL had a topic about war, about the United States and the police committing war against Black populations. And that right now there is the war on drugs, literally, is an actual war on Black populations, especially if you consider the police to be an occupation of Black communities. So, I want to ask, Amina, does anybody know Amina? Yeah, Amina, I asked her, so there's the bougie parts of Baltimore and, the not bougie parts, like the hood. And I asked her, so how can you tell the difference between the two? She's like, police presence. The hood, there's more police presence than suburban area.
You know how traffic cams? But, for crime, just on the corner where the stoplight is, right next to that is just, a big camera just surveilling the entire, every city block for a while.
Mhm.
generally on the east side of Washington.
Does it pop me up in Boston?
Away from the water. Yep.
Yeah.
I mean,
Exactly.
they'll catch you if they're not there. Walmart parking lot, have y'all noticed those big yellow boxes? Like, they're like, we don't need to hire police, security, whatever. It's like police in the parking lot. Like, they just stick a pole up with cameras on it and they just watch you all day long.
The other is go ahead.
Not even just police presence, but just the USFG writ large. Like, don't forget that Tulsa, Oklahoma was the site of the largest domestic bombing in U.S. history, and it was a black community, properly known as Black Wall Street, because of the accumulation of black businesses, right? And so, like, the police presence, military presence, U.S. federal government action, and their accumulation, right, are all sort of this like aggregation of anti-blackness.
And lastly, the last aspect of the topic, we can talk about the border because a lot of affirmatives will talk about ICE, and so we can talk about the border as a form of violence and a form of war. So the first sentence in Gloria Anzaldúa's book, the U.S.-Mexican border is where the third world grates against the first. It didn't say here, and bleeds. So the border is where the first world grates against the third and bleeds. Meaning, or actually, I can ask you, what does that mean?
Say it again. Wait.
Right here. The U.S.-Mexican border is where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. What does that mean? I know it's like, but I mean, the border is where the border is bleeding. What does that mean for the border to bleed?
The border is harmful.
Yes.
That was my thought.
Is that your seminal cross-sex example of how we explain these things? Can you go further, please?
Colonialism, the border, like disrupts non-colonial existence and creates an artificial thing, which like damages the actual indigenous like existence.
Good. Fucking ruins people's lives. Right. In fact, the border also runs through indigenous land, the Tohono, for example. And in fact, a lot of Tohono individuals are experience police violence and violence from Border Patrol as well. So who here debated which topic was it? I don't know. There was a topic that talked about the Tohono. If anybody debated it. It was surveillance topic, right? Yeah. That one talked about Border Patrol on Tohono land and the police brutality that they experience. Yeah, it was. So I want you all to think about not just the topic, but about what Derrida would call to deconstruct each of these words on the topic. War just doesn't mean war. War also means violence, and violence can look like many things. You can talk about violence at an interpersonal level, domestic violence, or like microaggressions, or you can talk about on a larger scale about imperialist warfare, etc. So okay.
Yeah. Tying that in with the whole Anzaldúa thing, like I think the real response to that would be like the other response is like first and third world, right? So you have America, which is first world, then you have Mexico, which is third world, like almost a third world living, and the border is literally like the thing that separates the first world from the third world. And Anzaldúa is also coming from like an identity perspective too. So if you're Mexican American, like Mexican/American, like that division in your identity also like causes violence to your like intrapersonal self. So the same way like there's a physical border that happens and causes violence, like the border that divides the first world from the third world, there's like a personal border that divides us, and the way that the government and society and stuff like characterizes what it means to be Mexican, for example. You have Trump speaking on what it means to be Mexican, and like an interpersonal level, like that commits violence to us. So we're talking about like that's like the everyday violence we're talking about. It's not like war per se, but it's like the interpersonal psychological violence that the executive branch perpetuates in like a level of identity and sense of self. That could be like that, for example.
Yeah. What does violence look like when it happens internally? Not just externally. This other article is required reading for everyone. The Gulf War did not take place. Pretty short, actually. Baudrillard was assigned to cover the first Gulf War, and so he decided to just write articles about like we don't really experience this war. This is just a media sensation, and what we're experiencing is media sensation. That's it. So yeah, pretty good postmodern take on war.
Talk about lazy journalism.
About what? Lazy journalism?
So the first Gulf War didn't happen.
Didn't happen.
Done.
Academics are the worst.
It's like deadline Sunday midnight, Saturday 11:59. What did happen?
For surveillance, I might make people read the entirety of Discipline and Punish by Foucault, but like if you don't have time, that's fair. But it's actually a pretty short book. But surveillance, what type of affirmatives can we talk about on surveillance from a critical perspective? What is surveillance? What does it mean to watch people?
Survey yourself.
Okay, self-discipline.
Yeah.
Okay, we can talk about that. So what would be an example of like a critical app that addresses the concerns of self-discipline?
Like the witness thing.
Okay, right. So can you explain that?
Like you're constantly self-monitoring, monitoring yourself to like be the perfect human white subject,
Mhm.
and like you like, abolish things like your gender, or you don't abolish, you conform
Yeah.
to like things like gender and speech patterns, like clothes, everything, culture.
Yeah, they call it the job interview voice, right?
Yeah.
when you want to sound white, they call it the job
Oh,
interview
no.
voice. Huh? What?
Like Dave Chappelle, he's
Oh yeah.
he's like, don't make me sound like I don't even know I sound like. Yeah, I'm doing well. How about you? I don't even sound like that.
What was that movie?
Sorry about you.
Sorry bothering you.
Oh yeah. That's an app. Sorry to bother you is like an entire app.
What's that?
It's a movie that came out this summer, like an independent
This
film
is
about.
Lakeith Stanfield.
He was a guy in Get Out.
Oh.
And he's like the psychiatrist in Atlanta.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's about a salesman who uses like his white customer service voice and suddenly becomes like a very, very good salesman. And then it's like I haven't seen it yet, but that's like a trailer.
What's it
Is it out yet?
Sorry about that.
Yeah,
Sorry
it's
for
a
a while. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it still theater?
Let's see. My high school students debated on the surveillance topic. So we had an app about the fetishization of Asian women and the way like the white male gaze is a form of surveillance that fetishizes Asian women. And then so the method was just like to deconstruct the Oriental myth of Asian women. That was pretty much it. But there are other alternatives that are pretty cool on the surveillance topic. The one that I like a lot is the idea of the counter gaze, meaning to look back. And that is, you can consider it more of like a counter surveillance of power. So who was I just talking? I think I was just talking to Michael about this. The fact that the development of like gangs in the hood were a form of counter surveillance against the police, and like what that looks like. So like, yeah, we can talk about that.
The whole point of Black Panthers, the whole point of like organized gangs, stuff like that, was the police.
Yeah, the Black Panthers would follow the police around, and when the police stopped someone at a traffic site, the Black Panthers would stop there with their guns, and then they would yell out like constitutional rights to the passengers in the other car. So yeah, like they literally kept them under their eyes. Because who watches the police? Nobody. So we have to, right? All right.
On that topic, I remember that year I ran this app where it was basically saying that surveillance. One of the reasons that happens is to like create subjects, right, or like to make sure that citizens are a certain type of subject. And so my partner and I said that doesn't really let a lot of people articulate themselves. And so then the whole app was re-articulating ourselves and basically reading poetry about like she was the 1AC was both of us, and so she would read poetry about being black, I would read poetry about being queer and brown. And so it's like re-articulating ourselves in the face of surveillance. And so it's like, this is what you don't want me to be, right? And so this is what we're gonna be anyway, basically. And so it was, I think that would be interesting because I'm thinking of a similar app, but it doesn't really have to do with any of those.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, then app could be like, girl, be your best self.
Yeah, that was basically.
Like how like surveillance makes people like almost like excluded within their own community. So like some aspects of like queer theory are like inaccessible to like queer people of color because it makes them like conform with like a certain way or like it perpetuates like stereotypes that they can't really like also they're excluded from like their queerness, but then they're also excluded from like just being people of color because they're like, queer. And so there's just like that in between. Yeah.
Yeah, Munoz writes a lot about disidentification, right?
Yeah.
Disidentification is a method of rearticulation of the self as a form of resistance to power. I had another idea.
I think there's a lot to be said about these, a couple things. These recent emergencies, first of all, you can definitely anticipate here, not that you want to run framework, the framework arguments being characterized as kind of protest. What is it like? Type like the
Barbecue
white
Becky.
The white people who have indoctrinated, who have been emboldened, and kind of deputized themselves as agents of the police or extensions of the police of the law, and thus they invoke the law in situations that doesn't need to be invoked against people of color, right? So that's that first kind of a characterization of framework. But I think there's a broader conversation to be had about the ways that whiteness and anti-blackness kind of either avenue you want to go, depending on whatever your lit interest is, about how those racialized orientations toward bias and being kind of, again, deputize white people to be extensions of executive authority, extensions of the law, and then to practice it at their women and have some anticipation for it. One interesting twist in this conversation is recently a black senator or something like that, I don't remember his official office, but was campaigning in his district and got the police calling him.
Oh, yeah.
And as a result, plans to introduce a bill that makes it now illegal for people to call 911 on people of color who have not committed a crime, or people in general, right? But that'd be a nice step to challenge, like 2NR. They didn't call the police on me, but we are reasonably tolerable. I mean, I'm sorry, 2AR. The 2NR has called the police, but we are reasonable within proximity to the resolutions. At the heart of the resolution, this is something that we have. It's necessary for us to talk about. These interrogations should come first. They are prerequisites in any attempt to delegitimize us. Auto default. You know what I'm saying? Act out. They don't deserve to win. They called you unnecessary. They wasted your time. We could have had a more productive conversation about this. And not only am I saying this in jest, like debate is bad, you should fix this in theory. No, punitive, material, collateral damage to people who invoke the name of the law in moments and situations on people of color, and a perpetuation of this historic legacy of doing so. That should never happen. Reject them on the merits of that. Like, reject it. They should have read it, reject it. Right? It should be the logic or the flavor of that argument and that approach.
Yeah, like all critical affirmatives address their argument from the basis of content and form. Content is just the theories that you talk about, right? The form is what does that look like in debate and how does that address debate, right? So when you think about each of these 5 topic areas, try to think about them in the context of debate, i.e. what does, I'm not sure about nuclear, but like what does war look like inside debate? What does violence look like inside debate? How is debate violent? Or what does trade or treaties look like in debate? What do we trade in debate? Social capital, balance, etc. And what treaties, what agreements do we come to before we come in to debate each other? Or in what ways do we enact surveillance within the community as well? And how does that play out? And what does your method do to be able to address that? Because one of the misconceptions about identity politics specifically is that people make it out to sound like we just come up there and say like, I'm oppressed, so please vote for me, right? And that's not the way it operates, and that's not the way it should operate. You have to have a method to defend. And that method should try to address the problems inside the context of the world that we live in, but also in the context of debate, because that's the space that you are inhabiting. All right, questions? All right, cool. I think that's it.
Yeah.